Today's story is about such a shocking and astonishing robbery, which neither the thieves robbed a bank, nor did they steal from a house, and neither did they make a car disappear. Instead, this gang of thieves stole expensive and valuable items from an entire coach of a moving train. The most surprising part was that these thieves didn't do it just once. They pulled it off multiple times. All these robberies were carried out in moving trains. By the time people realized what had happened, it was already too late. The gang responsible for these thefts wasn't some ordinary gang, but a team of several individuals who worked in a completely professional manner. And by the time the railway authorities found out about these thefts, goods worth several million US dollars had already gone missing. The way this gang planned the robberies and the method they used to carry them out was so astonishing that when the police came to know about it, they were completely shaken. That's the reason why the police faced several difficulties in catching them. So how did they rob moving trains? And how did they eventually get caught? This story will shake you to your core. The story begins in New Jersey, where, on a December night, a freight train carrying goods worth several million US dollars departs from New Jersey. But the train driver was unaware that something was about to happen, something he would never forget. This freight train had just left the station and wasn't going very fast yet. Out in the dark, a gang of people was waiting by the tracks. As the train picked up some speed, two people from the gang started running alongside one of the train's coaches. One of them grabbed the handle and hung onto the coach, broke the lock, and got inside. Once inside, they let the rest of the gang in. By the time the train reached the next station, all the valuable goods were gone, and so were the thieves, without leaving a single trace. This wasn't the first robbery. These thefts had been happening for a while, and millions of US dollars worth of goods had already gone missing. Leaving the police puzzled, the gang carrying out these thefts was known as the Connell Boys, and they were considered the most dangerous train robbery gang in all of America. But the biggest question was, when the police already knew the gang's name, how did this gang continue pulling off such heists for so long? And why did it take the police so long to catch them? In the 1990s, freight trains were the lifeline of Eastern American businesses, transporting billions of US dollars worth of consumer goods from one city to another. Most of these freight trains passed through New Jersey because of its large warehouses. From there, goods were shipped to New York and other cities. These warehouses contained all sorts of valuable items, electronics, designer clothes, and many other expensive goods. All this was handled by a company called Connell, which was the region's largest logistics company. They were responsible for transporting thousands of freight cars from one city to another daily. Connell's rail network was massive, stretching from industrial zones to small towns and remote villages across America. That reach was a strength for their business, but also came with major challenges. One of their biggest problems was tracking every freight coach, which often led to errors. The rail yards where these coaches were parked did have guards and electric fences, but there were so many cars that it was nearly impossible to monitor every one of them. And this job became even harder when the trains were moving between cities. While logistics companies struggled with these problems, the Connell Boys, the gang of thieves, saw an opportunity. They began watching the entire logistics system and the rail yards very closely. They focused on three things: how the logistics system worked, which trains carried the most valuable items. When the security was at its weakest, they did this because they didn't steal just any item. Their targets were luxury items, like designer clothes, electronics, and anything with high resale value. That's the reason their gang once successfully stole $200,000 worth of Tommy Hilfiger designer clothes. The gang was carrying out these thefts so cleanly that Connell Logistics had to deploy armed officers on their trains, but even that couldn't stop the gang. And the reason was the man who ran the whole gang, the mastermind behind everything. His name was Edward Mungan, and he was born in a house located right next to the railroad tracks in New Jersey. From childhood, he would watch freight trains go by from his window. Trains, to him, were nothing less than treasure. Edward became fascinated with the trains passing by his house. By the time he turned 16 in the early 1900s, he and his friends had started sneaking into rail yards where freight trains were parked. He understood from a very young age that these freight trains carried valuable goods between cities. So he started observing train timings in which coaches had valuable items, and where they were parked in the rail yard. At the age of just 16, he was arrested for his first robbery, stealing from a parked freight train in the yard. And this was the beginning of Edward's journey toward becoming the leader of America's biggest train robbery gang. After being released from jail, he resumed committing small thefts. Gradually, over time, he progressed to stealing from entire coaches. He became deeply familiar with every inch of the rail yard and every activity that took place there. And during one of these robberies, he got hold of something that changed his life forever and made him the biggest train robber in America. During a heist, Edward found a walkie-talkie radio, the kind used by train drivers and warehouse employees. This device worked just like a police walkie-talkie. When two people talked on it, the conversation could be heard on every device in range. Now Edward started listening in on conversations between train engineers, yardmasters, and even the police. This allowed him to track train movements and learn internal security information that proved incredibly useful. Using this information, Edward started planning each heist with great precision. And because he had inside information, he was able to execute each robbery with remarkable finesse. By now, the 1990s had arrived, and Edward's small team had turned into a full-fledged gang known as the Connell Boys, led by none other than Edward Mongan. To pull off these robberies and outsmart rail yard security, Edward came up with several clever methods. One such method was using jumper cables to disable the electric current running through security fences. Within this gang, Edward had a key man named Michael Senti, the person responsible for managing the entire gang and preparing everyone for the thefts under Edward's command. Due to the rapidly increasing number of robberies, rail yard security was tightened significantly, which led to Edward and his gang were no longer able to carry out robberies, and that's when Edward decided that he would start targeting moving freight trains. From here, the story takes a completely new turn, one that would leave everyone stunned. Bye. Now, Edward and his gang had become a clever and organized group that began planning their heists several weeks in advance, and aiding them the most was the walkie-talkie radio, through which they could learn exactly which coach had valuable goods and where the security guards were positioned. Besides the walkie-talkie, Edward had stationed his gang members outside the rail yard and along the dark edges of the railway tracks to keep an eye on the freight train and alert one another. They were primarily observing the train timings and the placement of the coaches. As soon as the right moment arrived, they would launch their operation. Edward had a separate team for boarding the coaches. As soon as they received the signal, they would start running alongside the train, grab the handles, and climb aboard the moving train. Once inside, they would break the lock and enter. After entering, these jumpers would start tossing out bundles of valuable items one by one, which were quickly loaded by other gang members into nearby parked vans. The drivers in those vans would then drive off with the stolen goods. These thefts were carried out with such perfect planning that every gang member knew exactly what they had to do, what their job was. This made the robberies almost perfect. Edward's entire gang operated like a military unit, with very little room for error. But the biggest question remained: how did Edward know what was kept inside each coach? Edward used the codes written on the sides of the coaches to identify what kind of goods were stored inside. Based on those codes, he would select which coaches to target. That covered the planning stage. But now comes the question of how they would escape. Because Edward planned everything from the robbery to the escape with meticulous precision. They would escape through industrial areas, deserted locations, or even swamps that were near the railway tracks. The vans used in these robberies were also stolen from railway yards so that the stolen goods could be transported quickly and efficiently. Thanks to Edward's planning, they were able to carry out every robbery flawlessly, while the police still couldn't catch them. Edward's gang initially started stealing stationery from parked coaches. Before these thefts, they would disable the electric current flowing through the fences outside the rail yard. They used jumper cables to disable the current. Once the electric current was down, they could easily climb the fences and enter the yard. For a while, they carried out thefts from parked trains with ease. But once the rail authorities realized that thefts were taking place, they increased rail yard security fourfold. That's when Edward decided that instead of targeting parked trains, he would go after moving trains. However, stealing from a moving train was no easy feat. It required not just excellent planning, but also physical strength and accurate knowledge of train timings. The most difficult part of the plan was identifying which coach had the valuable goods. And Edward had to figure that out from the moving train, using the codes written on the side, the entire gang would hide near the railway tracks, waiting for the right moment to strike. As soon as the freight train left the yard and hit the tracks, some members of the gang would get active and begin running alongside the train. They would carefully match the speed of the train, about 15 to 20 kilometers per hour. To avoid injury or failure, while running beside the train, they would grab the coach handles to maintain balance. Once they identified the targeted coach, they would climb aboard. The gang used special tools to break the coach locks and enter. Once inside, they quickly started tossing out bundles of valuable items, which were carried to vans by the gang members waiting outside. These vans would then disappear with the stolen goods. The entire robbery had to be completed within just a few minutes before the train reached the next station. If they took longer than planned, they risked getting caught. These robberies were planned so meticulously that, while the bundles were being loaded into vans, another team from the gang kept a watch on police in nearby surroundings. In case the police approached, they would send out a warning. After throwing the bundles, the team inside the train would jump out and disappear into nearby deserted areas. Edward came up with another tactic to make his planning even easier. He began impersonating a warehouse dispatcher over the stolen walkie-talkie radios. Through this, he started receiving minute-by-minute updates on train movements, when a particular freight train would leave, and what valuable goods it carried. Using this inside information, Edward and his gang stayed 2 steps ahead of the police. They were now executing heists that seemed impossible for anyone else in this entire operation. Edward's gang used Nextel phones, and they had created their own code language. Even if the police tapped their calls, they couldn't understand what they were talking about, and this proved to be a major strength for them, allowing them to plan their robberies without fear. Alongside the robbery planning, Edward had also built a buyer network, a solid list of buyers who would purchase the stolen goods. Edward personally handled all the dealings. He met the buyers himself and sold the stolen goods directly. The most surprising part was that no one in the gang knew who these buyers were, and Edward always kept this secret. He didn't want the police to ever trace one of the buyers, which could lead to the gang's downfall. As the gang continued executing these perfect robberies, their earnings kept increasing. But at the same time, they started coming under police scrutiny. By the time the 1990s arrived, the Connell Boys gang was at the top of the police hit list, because the rail companies had suffered losses of several million US dollars due to their thefts. And pressure from the government and media on the police was mounting to catch this gang as soon as possible. Because Edward and his gang were now they had become experts in committing thefts, and by December 1997, they executed their most brilliant robbery yet. This time, the freight train boogie they targeted contained approximately $2.2 million worth of Tommy Hilfiger designer clothes. And once again, their planning had started several days earlier. Edward, using stolen walkie-talkie radios, was able to determine which boogie contained the designer clothes and where that boogie was located in the train. This is where the job began for those members who were assigned to monitor the train and boogies, so that they could avoid alerting anyone to possible threats. The theft was planned in a deserted area beside the railway tracks in North Bergen, New Jersey. It was an industrial zone with complete silence around, making it the perfect location to carry out the robbery. Everything was planned. Just like before, the jumpers would run and climb into the boogie, throw the bundles outside after, which those bundles would be loaded into waiting vans that would then flee the area. After leaving the rail yard, the train had reached a speed of 15 to 20 kilometers per hour, neither too fast nor too slow. Despite this, The jumpers began running with the train's speed, grabbed the handles, and climbed up. They had brought crowbars with them to break the boogie lock, and as soon as they entered, they found themselves in front of boxes full of Tommy Hilfiger designer clothes. Their plan had worked perfectly, and just as they had hoped, the exact goods were found. Inside, they then started calmly throwing the boxes out of the train, one by one, so they could be loaded into the vans. Each box was worth thousands of dollars, and Edward's gang knew very well that they had to complete the theft in just a few minutes before the next stop arrived, so they could jump off the train and escape. Edward was monitoring the entire robbery over the phone to ensure that everyone could escape at the right time. In just 10 minutes, they had thrown 50 boxes out of the boogie, and then they all vanished into the night. When the freight train reached its next stop, a rail yard worker found the boogie empty and the designer clothing boxes missing, leaving him stunned. This clearly showed that the Cornell boys were no ordinary thieves. In fact, they had pulled off one of the greatest and most sophisticated train robberies in American history. And that too, without leaving a single clue. News of the theft spread like wildfire throughout New Jersey. Law enforcement became determined to catch the Cornell boys gang at any cost. After committing such heists, the gang left behind no evidence and disappeared in such a way that for several years, the police couldn't track them down. Even though the police knew who was behind the thefts, they still couldn't prove anything. Against the Cornell boys, Edward always focused on targeting boogies carrying valuable goods, as he didn't want his gang to take such high risks for petty theft. As a result, they succeeded in earning thousands to millions of dollars in every robbery. Edward would sell the stolen goods to his buyers, from whom he received cash on the spot, which he would then divide among the gang, keeping the largest share for himself. Apart from money, Edward also helped his gang members in many other ways, which is why they remained loyal to him for years. Despite being hunted by the police day and night, Edward and his gang had now made so much money that they began living a luxurious lifestyle, driving expensive cars, wearing branded clothes, and visiting luxurious clubs and restaurants for leisure. Edward too started gambling at casinos, spending huge sums of money, and now the whole gang was living like kings. But at the same time, the risk of getting caught was increasing, mainly because of the infamous robberies that had their fingerprints all over them. Each theft left a question for the police department, which they couldn't solve. Under growing pressure, they decided to take a new approach to crack the case. By the year 2000, the Cornell boys had become the most wanted criminals and thieves, and catching them had become the top priority for law enforcement. Federal agencies teamed up with local and state police to catch them, but their biggest challenge was the vast railway network they had to investigate in order to find the thieves. This railway network spanned hundreds of kilometers through industrial zones, small towns, and desolate routes in New Jersey, making it impossible for the rail department to monitor every area. The Cornell boys took full advantage of this, targeted locations where no one would notice them. The gang's biggest asset was the walkie-talkie radios, through which they received all the information, along with encrypted Nextel phones used to coordinate the entire robbery. Another major reason behind the gang's success was Edward's cunning. He planned the robberies in such a way that each gang member only knew his specific task. Without knowing the full plan or who the stolen goods were sold to. Because of this setup, even if one gang member was caught, they wouldn't have enough information to help the police. One more problem the police faced in this investigation was that train robberies were considered property crimes, meaning even if a thief was caught, he'd be released after a minor sentence. Edward knew this very well, which is why he carried out his heists without fear or hesitation. But he was unaware that the police were now planning a move to put him behind bars permanently. Police began working on a strategy to charge Edward and his gang with racketeering, and that was the one approach through which they could dismantle the entire gang and put them behind bars. Their first breakthrough came when they caught a buyer who purchased and resold the stolen goods. He provided solid evidence that established a direct connection between the Cornell boys and the robberies. Since the police wanted to catch Edward and his gang red-handed, they started closely tracking their movements to build a strong case against During surveillance, they discovered that Edward frequently visited casinos in Atlantic City, where he blew thousands of dollars on gambling and flaunted his wealth. This made it clear that although Edward was smart in pulling off the thefts, he was equally careless and foolish in hiding them. And this carelessness led to his downfall. With the help of a tech engineer, police also started tracking calls between Edward and his gang. The same calls that had kept them 2 steps ahead of the law were now becoming their biggest threat. Police began listening to each call in detail and recording them, which gave them full insight into the gang's operations, how they carried out the robberies, how they escaped, and to whom Edward sold the stolen goods. Now the police were fully prepared to arrest the entire gang in December 2001. The police learned that Edward and his key man Michael were going to a nightclub. Police decided to raid the nightclub, involving 20 undercover officers dressed in civilian clothes so as not to alert Edward. All officers positioned themselves at different spots inside the club to keep an eye on Edward and Michael. As soon as the 2 exited the club, police surrounded and immediately arrested them. By now, the police had ample evidence against the gang, including recorded calls, CCTV footage, and buyer testimonies. The court then charged Edward and his gang with fraud, theft, and conspiracy, sending a total of 23 gang members, including Edward, to jail. And in this way, the police caught the biggest train robbery gang in American history. Later, the Cornell Boys gang trial began in court, where the lawyer explained how the gang had stolen millions of dollars worth of goods from rail yards and freight trains, how they had evaded police for years, and how the entire plan was executed. Edward was declared the mastermind behind these robberies and sentenced to 13 years in prison. His key man Michael was sentenced to 10 years, and the rest of the gang received sentences between 5 and 12 years. This was a huge victory for the police department. But these robberies also exposed many flaws in the railway system, which the gang had exploited. Had the gang not flaunted their wealth, they might never have been caught. But due to their arrogance and extravagance, the police suspected them and eventually caught them. This was the story of the gang that executed America's most iconic train robbery. It got caught due to their own foolishness. Even today, they are remembered as the most cunning train robbers in history.